and the number of people involved. So, thank you, Mr. President.
I call the honourable member Holly Walker.
Focus my comments in this Part 1 debate in the Committee of the Whole stage on Part 1, Clause 25, new Section 60 RA, which concerns the social obligations of certain beneficiaries with dependent children. And Mr. Chair, I'd like to start by reminding the House of some documents which were tabled in the House last week by my co-leader Materia Ture during question time. Now, those documents were advice from the Ministry of Health on the sanctions imposed in this bill and their likely impact on child health and well-being. Mr. Chair, if we listen to the Minister's rhetoric about this bill, I think we could be forgiven for thinking that that advice would be very favourable, because the Minister repeatedly contends that by making well-child checks, tamiki order checks compulsory and a sanctionable social obligation under this bill, that the health outcomes of children will be improved. Indeed, that's her stated motivation for including meeting well-child check obligations as one of the social obligations introduced in this bill. But, Mr. Chair, with a minister so adamant about improved outcomes for children, we might assume that she would have heard from officials that the policy would actually achieve better outcomes for children. But sadly, Mr. Chair, we'd be very wrong to assume so, because actually the documents that were tabled in the House last week by my co-leader show that advice from Ministry of Health officials in fact showed the exact opposite of that. Now, health officials were so concerned about the policy to sanction parents for not getting well-child checks for their children that they repeatedly warned the Minister that such sanctions would cause, and I quote, substantial negative impacts on families and vulnerable children, including risks of increased maltreatment and neglect, end quote. It's clear from this advice, Mr. Chair, that officials were concerned that the integrity and the effectiveness of the well-child checks program would be compromised and undermined if well-child checks were to be seen as a sanction or a punishment by parents, as they indeed would be if they were made compulsory for a section of the population under this bill, under Part 1, Clause 25. Ministry officials were also concerned that there's no strong evidence that health-related social obligations are needed, and they gave clear advice to the Minister that the best way to reach families who are not receiving well-child checks at the moment is by improving the delivery mechanisms for well-child checks, not by imposing financial sanctions on the parents on beneficiary parents, which are simply likely to lead to further harm to the child. And they repeatedly gave this advice to the Minister as part of interdepartmental consultation on the development of this legislation, but they didn't get anywhere. So they also wrote to the Minister of Health, and they pleaded with the Minister of Health to ask this Minister to investigate alternatives to sanctions for non-compliance with well-child checks because of their concerns about the potential negative health and well-being impact that this could have on children. But to no avail. And sadly, Mr. Chairman, sanctions remain in this bill for parents who don't meet requirements of well-child checks, as well as other social obligations listed in Part 1, Clause 25. And those sanctions could, and in some cases will, mean that parents see a loss of their benefit of up to 50%. And I think, Mr. Chair, that these sanctions represent a punitive, ideological approach by this Minister, unwilling to listen to advice or indeed evidence about the likely impact of the policies, but committed to them nonetheless. And Mr. Speaker, Mr. Chairman, what the Ministry of Health advice that was tabled by my co-leader in the House last week, I think, highlights is the potentially harmful impact of the sanctions in this bill on children, because children will be even less likely to access the healthcare that they need and to get the benefit of the well-child checks program if they're made compulsory for beneficiaries as proposed in this bill. But the other obvious way in which sanctions will harm children is the impact that the loss of income will have on children whose parents, for whatever reason, for failing to meet their social obligations, are sanctioned under this bill. Mr Chairman, the DPB, depending on the circumstances of the person receiving it, but the base level payment of the domestic purposes benefit is $293 per week. So 50% of that, if you were to lose, Mr Chair? Mr.
Holly
Chair?
Walker.
Thank you, Mr Chair. Tēnā. If you were to lose 50% of the payment of $293 per week is $146.50 per week. And Mr Chair, I defy any parent to be able to provide the necessities of life for their children for $146.50 per week. And Mr Chair, it's very important that we think about what we are actually condemning children to live on whose parents are sanctioned under this legislation, and what that means for their well-being and their daily lives, and the ability of their parents to meet their children's needs. Now, children have the same needs, whatever the circumstances that their parents are in, whether their parents are in paid work, in receipt of a benefit, whether their parents are compliant with the social obligations introduced by this legislation or not. Children have the same needs. That's needs like a warm, safe, secure home, adequate food and nutrition, clothing, shoes, raincoats, warm clothes, and the ability to participate in their education, to take part in school trips, school camps and so on, all of which parents will find it very difficult to provide if they have their income cut by 50% for non-compliance with the social obligations introduced in Part 1 of this bill. Children have these needs and they don't control their parents' circumstances, and yet their parents need income to be able to provide them with these necessities of life. And we in the Green Party, Mr Chair, are very concerned that many children will be deprived of these necessities if their parents are sanctioned under this bill. And that's why I've proposed an amendment which is set out on Supplementary Order Paper number 197, which states, and I'll read it, that a beneficiary's failure to comply with a social obligation cannot be the subject of a sanction under Section 117 if the beneficiary has one or more dependent children and the Chief Executive is satisfied that the sanction may deprive the child of food or shelter or would otherwise be detrimental to the well-being of the child. And Mr Chair, it would be my contention that prioritising children, which is something the Minister often says she wants to do, means that we must give consideration to a dependent child who is supported by a parent against whom sanctions may be enforced under this bill. And the impact on this child, on his or her basic rights to food, shelter and safety must be considered. And to allow for this, Mr Chair, and which we allow for in this supplementary order paper, a discretion should be provided to the Chief Executive that when imposing sanctions, they may take into account the interests of dependent children. And Mr Chairman, it's our contention that this actually would bring us much more into line with our international obligations under Articles 26 and 27 of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, which talk about the rights of children and citizens to social security to support themselves. Mr Chairman, we hear a lot about prioritising children from this Minister and indeed from parties all across this House. And this supplementary order paper gives the House the opportunity to demonstrate its commitment to prioritising children in our social security legislation by allowing that discretion to the Chief Executive to actually consider the impact on dependent children before imposing a sanction. We've heard from officials from the Ministry of Health who advised the Minister and even begged their own Minister to intervene that the specific sanction around well-child checks is likely to actually lead to detrimental health outcomes for children. And beyond that, the simple fact of the loss of income represented by a 50% sanction for non-compliance with any of the social obligations introduced in Part 1 of this bill, for the children who live in the households whose parents will lose that income through no fault of their own and with no control over their parents' circumstances, will find it very difficult to have their basic needs for food, clothing and shelter met. And we think at the very minimum the Chief Executive should have the discretion to take that into account when deciding whether to impose a sanction, and that's why we have moved the supplementary order paper number 197.
I call the Honourable Member Sua William Sio. Te lofa la.